On Wednesday, Donald Trump met with Micheál Martin, the Irish Prime Minister, and I was listening to some of what he said on one of my favorite podcast shows, What a Day, this morning while I was getting ready for work, and something caught my attention.
Trump welcomed Martin to the Oval Office with this backhanded compliment.
Look, the Irish is smart. We are smart people. And you took our pharmaceutical companies and other companies, but through taxation and proper taxation.
More than 90.
So, most people know that I'm a tax professor and I teach tax policy and write academic research about corporate tax avoidance, among other things. One particular area of interest to me is corporate tax inversions. That just means that a US company moves its country of incorporation to another country, usually to a tax haven, a low tax country. I could talk for hours about tax havens and corporate inversions. I spent years collecting information about the companies that invert, why they invert, the impact that that has on our economy. Um, my interest in this topic was probably fueled by the time I spent working and living in a tax haven as a tax accountant. So, in fact, this is what I wrote my dissertation about. So, what Donald said here really made my ears perk up. What he's talking about is how in the early 2010s, many companies, pharmaceutical companies specifically, packed up shop and moved to Ireland. They built manufacturing companies there and they shifted massive amounts of profit there. They did this because of favorable tax laws and other favorable corporate policies that made this move really attractive. So what Donald is saying here, proper taxation, I really think is a big red flag about what he's actually trying to accomplish with his presidency. Trump is trying to make the US a tax haven for billionaires. In 2017, when he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, he already had taken massive steps towards this end. He drastically reduced the corporate tax rate, he created a quasi-territorial tax system, and now he and the entire Republican Party are working to push tax legislation that will further this mission. They are trying to cut the corporate tax rate even more and reduce the tax burden for global business leaders and our wealthiest population. Now, all that is well and good. I'm a savvy business person. I can appreciate the appeal of attracting foreign capital into the US, but there are some big problems here that we need to talk about. Havens still need revenue, specifically a giant company like or giant economy like the US. So if we're going to be reducing or even eliminating the income tax system, which he has said many times that he'd like to do, then we are going to need to get income from other sources, right? We need to be able to fund our government, to build roads, to provide resources for our citizens. That's why he's pushing for tariffs. He wants to use tariffs to fund our country. He says that after some bumps in the road, right, tariffs are going to save our country. He wants to use tariffs to bring in revenue so that he can cut income taxes for large multinational corporations and for their billionaire owners. So let's talk about tariffs. There are two potential uses for tariffs. Tariffs can either, one, be used as revenue generators because they increase the cost of products and essentially act as a sales tax, or they can be used as a tool to protect U.S. industries by increasing the cost of certain foreign products to encourage investment in their U.S. competition. They can do either of these things, but they can't really do both because if they're generating additional revenue, then they are by definition not acting as a protection mechanism and vice versa. So what Donald is proposing is that they'll do both, which is not realistic. But I think the thing that he's most concerned with is that they're at least doing the first one, that they're generating revenue, because then he can cut income taxes even more. He's talking about cutting taxes for businesses, for wealthy individuals, and we can talk about that tax policy that they're trying to push through once the actual details of the bill get released. But because the budget reconciliation is still being drafted. But the things that they're talking about cutting are are really scary. They're talking about cutting tax benefits for parents, like pulling back on the child tax credit, a credit that lifted 1.2 million children out of poverty during the pandemic, potentially cutting education benefits, like removing the student loan interest deduction, taxing scholarship income. There's some really bad stuff on the chopping block here. But again, that's a discussion for another day once the details of the reconciliation package are actually released. But for now, let's talk about why tariffs should not be used to generate revenue to pay for tax cuts for businesses and wealthy individuals. The problem with tariffs is that they're actually a regressive tax system. And that means that as your income goes up, your effective tax rate is actually going to go down relative to your higher income. Here, let me share a really simple example that I was showing my class the other day. If tariffs increased the median household expenses by 2,600, I forget where I pulled this number. It was some source online somewhere. But it doesn't matter what the number is, right? That there's some kind of median average that the households will take on. As you look at the income by quartiles, or I guess the lowest 10th percent, the median, and the highest 90th percentile, you can see that the effective tax rate, so the tariff divided by the income, your effective tax rate actually goes down as your income goes up. Now, one of my students in class pointed out, well, if you're a wealthier individual, you're probably going to be spending more. So I think that's true. The tariff amount will actually probably increase with your wealth at least a little bit, but it's still going to be a regressive tax system. Now, in the US, long ago, we decided that as a society, we want a progressive tax structure. And that means that the more wealth that you earn, the more taxes that you should be paying. So using tariffs to generate revenue would be regressive instead of progressive. So it's kind of against the policies that we've put in place for our country. I keep hearing people say that we're going to make America great again through the use of these tariffs. But the last time that tariffs were actually used as an income tax generating, or as I guess a tax generating structure, was in the early 1900s. So tariffs were actually higher then than they had ever been. And progressives said that it was a tax on the little man. Um, in fact, the rise of the income tax system was actually in response to the overblown use of tariffs at the time. People realized that they were hurting the working class. Now, history of income tax system and tariffs is not really my area of expertise, but I do know that this was a time where corruption was rampant in the government and in business and between the two, and that the rise of the income tax system was an attempt to move towards this progressive tax structure that we have now. The system that they were using at the time was harming the working class and benefiting only the largest corporations and the wealthiest of individuals. So, sound familiar? Now, Donald and the Republican Party now want to turn back time to a regressive tax structure, to use these new tariffs to fund the government and cut corporate taxes and cut taxes for wealthy individuals. Like I said, we can talk about the details of the new tax policy another day once it's released. But believe me, there will be policies in there that cut corporate taxes and that attract foreign business to the US. And Donald will say that this will be good for our economy, that this will be good for us in the long run. And maybe part of that's true, right? This will be good. But for wealthy individuals, it'll be good for wealthy investors. He wants to turn the US into the next great tax haven. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, tax accountants like myself and tax lawyers helped big businesses and wealthy individuals move their money into tax havens and reduce their tax liabilities. But we as a society, we have moved past this. In fact, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, has spent the last 2 decades developing fair and equitable international cooperation, moving towards an international tax system where we can make sure that no one country can artificially shift all this income just because they're changing their tax policies. That's stupid, right? Like a race to the bottom is not going to benefit anyone. How do we fund our government? How do we feed our people? How do we build our roads and keep providing the resources that our citizens need if we just keep fighting to help billionaires get richer so that they bring their business to us. It's not a winning situation, at least not for the working class. It's a losing situation for our poorest individuals and for our hardworking middle class. It is only a win for the wealthiest billionaire class. Donald wants to make it so that international investors want to ship their income somewhere so that they don't get taxed, that they can send it to the US. He's going back to the 90s, back to the early 2000s. He's acting like a tax dodger in the 90s, where countries were fighting each other to cut down their revenue to try to attract business in order to make billionaires more wealthy. This is what happened in Ireland, and that is what Trump wants to happen here in the US. And he wants our working class to pay for it. Now, I think that the changing tax policy and the use of these tariffs is very intentional. I'm not sure if the volatility of the market that's happening right now due to Trump's kind of will he, won't he erratic policies. I don't think that's intentional. I think that's just kind of Donald being a bad businessman. Like, let's not forget that Trump is a bad businessman. He has so many failed businesses, a lot of losses. So some of this mess right now with the stock market, I think, is really just because he's not a good businessman. He's stubborn and he doesn't want to listen to advice. But the coming tax cuts for the wealthy, the use of regressive tax structure through tariffs as revenue generators, turning the US into a tax haven for billionaires, that I think that that is intentional. And yeah, sure, being a tax haven, it could be good for business, right? It'll be good for large multinational businesses that want to shift income into the US to reduce their overall tax liability. It'll be good for wealthy individuals who want to hide their wealth here. But it will come at the cost of the working class. Let's not give up without a fight. Get informed, use your voice. Let's tell Congress what we think of Donald's plan to turn the US into a tax haven for billionaires. Thanks.